Hi, I'm Othais, and this is an actual Fabrique Nationale model of 1900, a militarized version of Le Pistolet Browning, the world's first slide-operated handgun. We'll learn about all of this and more after we toss this little guy in the light box. Weighing in at 1.3 pounds and with an overall length of 6.4 inches, this is an eminently pocketable semi-automatic pistol. And it also introduced the 32 ACP cartridge, although at that time it was still just called 7.65. The magazine is detachable, single stack, and can carry 7 rounds. That's one more than your average revolver. As you might have noticed, this episode is our second crack at the FN 1900. Such a revolutionary and influential design deserves our very best efforts, and we've come a long way from our first attempt to cover the history of this piece. While we have worked very hard to improve, much of our current capability is because of growing help from viewers like yourself. Please consider supporting the show and get access to early releases and our behind-the-scenes podcast over at Patreon or Player. Consistent support has also come in the form of this green and red can. What lies inside is simply the best thing you could do for all of your collectibles, and many of you have.
Carl said he was able to clean up and restore an old drill press with the help of Ballistol. He's finding new uses all the time. German engineer said, being in Germany, he uses Ballistol as his gun oil. He wasn't even aware there were others. It's the go-to over there. And Volan said he uses Ballistol for his skillet, knives, and especially the ones of carbon steel, and his safety razor.
Give it a try and make sure to say that we sent you. Now, I don't think I'm going to surprise any of you when I say that today's episode is centered on famed firearms inventor John Moses Browning. We'll try to just hit the highlights though. Born in Ogden, Utah, January 23rd of 1855, he was son of Jonathan Browning, a Mormon blacksmith and gunsmith who had settled in Ogden in 1852. Son John Moses was the first child born to father's second wife. He would actually later take on a third wife and ultimately fathered some 22 children in total. Not all, of course, survived their early years. This was the American frontier after all. Father, Jonathan, had been 50 years of age at the time of John Moses' birth, leaving a fairly large gap between the children of his first wife and his latter two. This made our inventor the eldest sibling of the new Browning brood. Growing up, Browning's education had been quite limited. He was schooled until age 15, achieving something akin to an 8th grade education. And just the year before, remote Ogden had become connected to the wider world by rail. The little town had, in 1869, become host to a railway station of the then nearly finished Union Pacific Railway. Becoming a major hub, the almost exclusively Mormon Ogden suddenly became culturally varied, occasionally downright debaucherous. In the bid to move goods across America, basically every invention known to the continent would now pass through Little Ogden, and as pertains to firearms, nary a one escaped Browning's inspection. Trained by his father, John Moses had been repairing and even manufacturing simple firearms since he was a small child. He even bought out his father's shop in 1878, about a year before his death, after which he'd have to buy it again, and never much care for his older siblings again. He shared the business with his younger brother, Matthew Sandifer Browning. Born in 1859, he had initially joined brother John in every facet of the business, hand-making and fitting parts for firearms repair. Around the time the brothers took on Dad's former business, John Moses came up with an idea for an improved falling block single-shot black powder rifle. The brothers did establish their own small factory and produced at least 25 examples of this patented rifle, but the invention was soon sold to a much larger manufacturer. This would become the Winchester Model 1885, loved for its efficiency of operation and simple construction. Browning had made a deal to sell the patent rights whole for a fixed price of $8,000. With this relationship established, Browning would soon begin to solve all sorts of problems for Winchester repeating arms. Next up was a powerful lever action, the 1886, which earned the Brownings some $50,000. From here, Winchester commissioned a repeating shotgun. Against his better sensibilities, John Moses whipped up what became the model of 1887, an awkward and unpopular product that was hampered by the strict order to keep it a lever-action operation. Following this, the Mormon Church sent John Moses on a 2-year missionary journey where he struggled in their most difficult frontier, the Deep South. Somehow, returning alive, our inventor got back to work cranking out another flurry of popular designs. Ultimately, Browning would sell Winchester a whole bushel of patents, some 34 of which were never even made into production firearms. The prices seem to have averaged around $10,000 a pop. That might seem like a lot to pay for a firearm that you'd never make, but Winchester used those extras as a way to lock out competition from the market. With money rolling in, the Browning brothers sought more opportunities, expanding their business in Ogden to include a sporting goods store. Matthew spent less and less time working as a gunsmith, ultimately becoming a businessman. His role as John Moses' partner in invention was taken up by half-brother Jonathan Edmund Browning, who thankfully went by Ed, or else the number of John Brownings would be far too confusing in this episode. Ed was born to Father Browning's third wife, just slightly older than Matthew actually. A skilled machinist, Ed began to work closely with John Moses. The elder brother would envision the desired mechanism and scratch out a vague drawing at best, or even just verbal description to younger Ed, and through a series of quick fabrications, a prototype would emerge. Once they had a working example, it could be patented, or by this point sent to Winchester for further refinement before patenting and production. Now the hits kept coming. The Winchester 1890 22 pump action rifle, the compact and sleek 1892 using basically pistol cartridges, and the amazingly engineered 1894, which fit a rifle cartridge in the same package. Walking back, there was the somewhat failed shotgun of 1893, though Winchester would later improve this into a heart winner. Then the unusual model 1895 with its vertical magazine and full-powered cartridges. Now, even while those shoulder arms were in the works, John Moses Browning had started working down another line of development. He had hit on a concept for a gas-operated machine gun. This would eventually lead to the Colt model of 1895, more commonly known as the Potato Digger, a then compact rapid-fire gun using a gas-driven underside lever. I guess Winchester had got in his head. It's worth mentioning that this firearm was licensed to Colts by way of a royalty agreement, though it wasn't a fast seller, so lump cash might have been a better decision at that time. During the development of his machine gun, Browning had, of course, visited Colt's patent firearms in Hartford, Connecticut. It was there that he met a Colts employee by the name of Hart Ostermer Berg. Born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, son of Jewish-German immigrants, Berg was naturally bilingual. Studying engineering and small arms technology in Liège, Belgium, he also learned French. Hart was well named as he was known to be friendly and charming, almost the opposite of the austere but polite John Moses Browning. The men did pretty well working together, becoming something of friends. This would soon yield a profit for both of them. Whether it was being at Colts or because of Berg himself, John Browning seems to have become curious about auto-loading pistol technology. Starting work on the problem in 1894, there was actually little to go on. The two dominant designs were still rather fiddly. One was overly complex, heavy, and cumbersome, and the other quite weak and perhaps somewhat delicate. Browning's first attempt to solve this problem was ready as a working prototype in 1895. This was basically an inverted Colt Potato Digger machine gun with a gas-operated spring lever over top. It's worth noting that this system already features a sliding breech block of sorts, with the rearward motion responsible for recocking the hammer. While functional, the design was unsatisfactory, supposedly for poor recoil and unnerving the shooters. It was not initially patented, but Browning later filed just in case, at the same time as he covered his second idea. The breech block is still sliding, but now wraps around the barrel as well, nearly the full length of the gun. This is essentially the first of what is now the standard for modern handguns. The autoloading mechanism works on a simple blowback principle, which does put a limit on how powerful of a cartridge could be comfortably used. Take note that much of our handgun today is already in this document. Overhead recoil spring, stirrup-style transfer bar off the trigger, and a heel release with a detachable box magazine. Colt's Patent Firearms, however, was more interested in this patent, another filed at the same time. It covered an improved locking system, in which the barrel was cammed up and down into and out of lock with the sliding breech block by a set of swinging links. Capable of chambering a powerful military-ready cartridge, this was the route that Colt chose to pursue. We actually have several episodes tracing this family of Browning designs until they ultimately resulted in the Colt model of 1911. Take note, Browning's deal with Colt's patent firearms on the matter of an automatic pistol was begun in 1896. While this resulted in a flurry of designs, they were frankly never strong sellers until the emergence of the much later 1911. And what limited sales that did occur didn't even begin until 1900. Browning wasn't one to make waste of a good idea, though. Sure, he might sell patents for cash that would never be produced, but now he had an unsold, unroyaltied working blowback pistol, and it just so happened to be something of a personal favorite. So, he kept tinkering at it, shrinking it down to be compact enough to fit in a common coat pocket of the day, and chambering it for a proprietary .32 caliber semi-automatic cartridge. Without giving too much away, this would later become what we commonly call the .32 Colt automatic pistol cartridge, which was a bit unfair because Colt had walked out on that project until some time later. The case is semi-rimmed, frankly almost rimless, making for reliable feed but easier head spacing. Overall, a fairly weak cartridge, but felt to be acceptable for personal defense while leaving room for concealability. While we might mock the .32 ACP today, for its time it was actually above average, as many pocket-ready .32 caliber revolvers were moving bullets much slower than that. Anyway, John Browning was really enjoying his newly prototyped pocket pistol. While Colt had no interest, he did manage to find an enthusiastic buyer elsewhere. It was actually thanks to his friendship with Hart Berg, who had actually left Colt's patent firearms even before they signed for Browning's lock-breech pistol. Traveling back to Liège, becoming a sales agent for the then quite new Fabrique Nationale, which, by the way, is a story unto itself and one that we've covered before, but given the topic, let's do a quick review. Liège had long been an arms-making city, being nestled in the Meuse Valley, full of coal, iron, and water. Over generations, various families had passed down their trades, forming a myriad of small, privately owned factories. This had been excellent for piecework, hand-fitted gun making, but in this new era of machine production and interchangeable parts, well, this wasn't good enough. In order to compete with international firms and preclude a government factory, arms makers started banding together to incorporate for larger factories for specific high-quantity contracts. One such example emerged to produce the Belgian Comblain of 1870, known as Le Petit Syndicat. More important was Le Fabricants d'Armes Réunis, formed in 1887 to affix 30,000 Vitali magazines to Beaumont rifles for the Netherlands. Many of these same gun makers from this endeavor would join hands again to form Fabrique Nationale in order to license and produce the German-designed Mauser rifle of 1889. We thankfully have a full episode on this particular bolt-action repeater. While successful at home, Fabrique Nationale struggled internationally. Having assembled a massive facility equipped with the latest in production technology, many of the investors thought it best to keep a good thing going, and to compete for more arms contracts. Some, however, dickered, and major names began to walk away, like Nagant and Francot, both of whom had their own fairly large production facilities, actually especially Francot. The rest, however, kept pushing, at least for a time, resulting in sales of the Mauser 1893 pattern to Brazil in 1894. Other requests began to flow in, however Mauser, proper, soon became unhappy. As we've covered in our Mauser 1895 episode, FN attempted to compete for the Chilean order. This resulted in a legal standoff with Ludwig Loewe, the company that oversaw Mauser Obendorf at the time. Without contract money coming in and with dubious legal standing for production, FN's investors were rattled, and many actually sold out. This created an opportunity for Ludwig Loewe, who bought up controlling interest in the Belgian firm. Loewe then reformed all of its arms-making businesses under the enterprise Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionfabriken. This was done in part to clarify the divisions and in part to shirk off public opinion against Loewe for problems with the production of the German Gewehr 1888 Commission rifle. Of course, DWM didn't want subsidiary FN to compete in the international rifle market. At best, they'd get some overflow scraps from big orders, and were basically parked to absorb any future Belgian government contracts. This, however, wasn't enough to keep the large factory going. Management realized that they would need to diversify in order to survive. Efforts were put on alternative products, especially bicycles at first, but they also began scrambling to produce commercial sporting arms. By this time, Hart Berg had risen to the Director of External Affairs and was tasked, much like the rest of management, with finding something to make that would sell well. Berg, of course, repeatedly wrote his friend in Ogden, asking him to bring anything of interest to Liège. John Moses Browning obliged him, bringing along all of his automatic pistols, but especially favoring the unloved pocket model. He left the US at the end of March in 1897. At FN, his prototype fired 500 rounds without a single failure, and it was convenient, simple to manufacture, and fairly inexpensive. Management was very pleased. Small problem though, they had to get DWM's permission to produce the product. There was some fear that the Germans rather protect their interest in the Borchardt pistol, which was then being modified by Georg Luger. With a European patent attorney to help him, Browning filed for patent on his pocket pistol in both Belgium and Germany. As we can see, this is almost exactly our pistol today, so I'll save the details for now and hold them over for our later examination. Patents filed, he took a trip to Germany to sell DWM on the concept, meaning John Moses Browning actually met with Hugo Borchardt and Georg Luger. Thankfully for FN, the German locked-breech military handgun wasn't seen as occupying the same lane as the diminutive blowback. The paperwork, however, wasn't immediately signed. Instead, Browning went home to the US, where in July of 1897, he and brother Matt traveled to Hartford to once again meet up with Hart Berg. This time, he was in the US to secure manufacturing rights to patents held by the Pope Bicycle Company. He managed this and to finalize the Browning contract, returning to FN with two new products for development: a pocket pistol and a shaft-driven bicycle. The agreement with the Brownings was for a 2,000 franc initial payment and then 2 franc for each pistol sold on royalty. If fewer than 5,000 were produced, the license would revert to the Brownings. This was likely a lesson learned from Colt's patent firearms in the 1895 machine gun. FN also agreed to place Browning's patent proudly on all of the pistols, something neither Winchester nor Colt had done this far. Browning wanted to establish his own brand. In exchange for all of this, FN received the rights to sell his pistols in Europe. John Moses also agreed to return to Belgium and assist with tool-up and initial production. This would be fulfilled with his staying in Liège from May through August of 1898. Prototypes started rolling out in the summer of that year, but full production seems to have begun in January of 1899. What they came up with was known as the Pistolet Automatique Browning. Even before full production began, FN put one of their prototypes in the hands of the Belgian War Department during 1898. While the initial response was positive, feedback suggested there would be no answer until later in 1899. Even so, there were a few initial complaints, and some of these were folded into the initial production, despite not yet being intended for martial service. They sold for 30 Belgian franc each, roughly $5.75 US at the time. 1,000 rounds of the .32 caliber cartridge, known in metric as 7.65, would cost you 55 francs. Now, you might have noticed this early Browning pocket pistol doesn't quite look like ours today. That's because it's what collectors retroactively know as the model of 1899, and I happen to have one here, so let's get a closer look at it. Alright, we have a fairly unusual looking semi-automatic handgun of diminutive proportions. Just to make that clear, I can pretty much hide this gun with one hand, almost, and it is so incredibly thin that my fat thumbs are thicker than the pistol itself. This would fit in a men's pocket at the time. Now, we have an ejection port on this side. It's slide operated, plastic grips, flip her over. Nothing really on this side except for the safety. These protrusions at the front are frame reinforcements. Technically, you could have this gun just go flat out to the front, but there was likely some flex, bending, and risk here for how thin this metal is and how much it has to support the sort of end point of the frame up against the slide. So these guys were bulked up just a bit to help out. And then at the back, we have our cocking serrations and we have our rear sight. Now, this is a magazine-fed pistol. It's a heel release, so if I pop this guy loose, we'll pull that out with our finger. Witness holes, 7 rounds of a .32 caliber cartridge. This gun does not have a hold-open device, so if we actually work the slide, it'll just go forward in the battery even when the pistol is empty. Now, if you let's see if I can get a better look at this. Our serrations are actually stair-stepped up onto a screw. Actually, yep, see, all the way through. And then it's one of a pair. There's a thinner one, same thing. It's actually retaining the breech block to the slide. They act as one piece, but they're actually two separate pieces in construction. If you look at the rear, you can actually see the inset for the breech block inside the larger slide. We'll be able to see that better in our animation. If I flip it over here, this guy is our breech block down there. There we go. This guy is the extractor sticking on forward. He disappears right up at the chamber mouth. If I go ahead and rack that open though, you'll be able to see, yep, breech block. Now, if we wanted to take this pistol apart, we could, in theory, remove these two screws. These obviously have been done at some point in its life. That one's gotten a little chewed up. And then we would separate the breech block from the slide. Unnecessary though, because it's not actually what you'd call a takedown. It's more of a true disassembly, not something we tend to do on the show unless there's something we really want to make a point of. Looking at the front of the pistol, we can see the barrel, and then we see a pocket with a little plunger cap on it that is retaining the recoil spring over the bore. This is actually a smart layout, as it puts the barrel much more in line with the firer's finger. That low bore axis transmits right across the top of the hand, and therefore has a much better inline function with your extended arm, and reduces your perceived recoil. Now, of course, with 32 ACP, it wasn't the worst to begin with, but it's still nice, and it adds a touch of making this gun almost entirely recoil-less when you're actually using it. Now, I keep talking about sort of the slide and operating the pistol, but I want to be very clear. This gun was remarkable because of its slide. Now, it doesn't look like a modern handgun externally, but this operation became the standard pretty much for all handguns going forward. The locking action, or lack thereof, was already in existence. Blowback wasn't unusual, which is that there is no lock in this gun. Just the force of the fired cartridge pushes on the breech block. The breech block's own weight plus the recoil spring resists that force backwards, but of course it's overcome, and therefore extracts and ejects the case. You can see the little ejector down in there, and then feeds the next one on in. It's also kind of interesting to see that with this guy back, we can actually see through the frame for that one section in which the breech block is recoiling with the slide. And then if I let this guy back forward, the overhand recoil spring is really what's just pushing it all back into alignment. See it better in the animation. The fact that it's on a slide though, the fact that the breech block along with this forward extension that wraps around the barrel moves together is entirely novel to this pistol, and therefore really defines the modern handgun. Yes, Browning also conceived of another version of this that goes on to be developed through Colt, but it didn't hit the market as quickly as this one did. So this really sets an operational standard of grabbing a pistol, loading a magazine, and then racking the slide back that we see on into today. Other pistols at the time tended to be breech block guns, where you would pull back the breech block out of, let's say it's short recoil, like a C96, there'd be sort of a shroud that comes off the back of the barrel, and that's how it worked. Like the barrel was attached to this sort of carrier that contained the breech block, which moved inside of it. No. Even though these are bolted together, they function as one continuous piece, and therefore this is a modern slide. It's also kind of fun to note that it is recessed into the frame, which is something that we tend to see in later automatic pistols, descending from sort of the SIG series, which, well, that's a whole other story for another day. The safety is a little unusual in that it's not marked. You just have to know where to put it. We have some textured concentric circles in order to help us operate that with our finger. This would be safe. This would be fire. And then also the original version of this would have had a swooping arrow about where this unfortunate scratch is that would have pointed over towards safe. That was a little confusing, and the government said, we're not big on that for the military orders. So that was gotten rid of, and apparently, at least on this version of the 1899, they hadn't come up with an alternative just yet. We're going to see that change in a moment. While we're this close to the pistol, I'll point out this one obviously had been damaged at some point, and someone did a crude job of using some sort of epoxy to approximate what the grip should be. The one on the other side of the pistol is intact, however, and you can see that FN has done a wonderful job of making sure that you have the correct grips with the correct gun. If you didn't know that you had an FN model of 1899, well, you could just check right here and see your picture of an 1899 with FN. You know what? Let's get a little closer. I'm straining the limits of my camera, but I believe there is actually an even smaller FN 1899 depicted in the grip of the FN 89 depicted in the grip of the, oh boy. What I find to be one of the most interesting parts of this gun is the sight block setup. which is, you know, just a big protuberance in order to get it high enough to fit that half moon front sight. And then we have a little U-notch at the back and a deep scallop to allow in plenty of light at the front. And at the very front, you see we have a hinge point and then a little tab. Now, I've looked at a lot of photos of 1899s, and the ones I've seen tend to have a shorter tab than the one depicted here. And yet, the original patent definitely has one that sticks out like we see on this gun. So I'm not really sure if it's just a matter of the parallax on the photos I'm seeing. You know, this is only 1899 I've handled, or what. But the original design in the patent does say that this is a cocking indicator and sight block intended to tell the shooter whether or not the gun is ready. Right now, with it in this down position, which you can see, it's sort of flat. It doesn't get in the way of the sight. In this down position, the shooter can obviously see their target. They know the pistol is cocked, not necessarily loaded, but cocked and ready to go. Now, I don't want to dry fire this piece, so give me one moment. I'm just going to slip in a little snap cap with a rubber base in there. This is not a real cartridge. Now, if I fire the pistol, you'll see that the tab has flexed up. When we look in our animation, we'll see how this is actually directly connected to the firing pin system on this gun. But at the moment, you just need to know that when the firing pin is forward, when the system is decocked, this guy pops up. And because he's popped up, we have a fairly clear indication that the pistol is not ready to fire. Now, if I go ahead and recock this, although I gotta get that casing out. There we go. You can see, yep, we're back to being able to find our front sight. Now, normally I would say let's see an animation or even put it in Mae's hands for demonstration, but the differences between this and the 1900 that are to come are so very minor. So let's just go ahead and press on for a bit. During 1899, the Belgian army finally got around to properly testing our little pistol. It competed against Borchardt, Mauser, Roth, Mannlicher, and Luger. Frankly, if nothing else, it must have stood out. All of these were bidding, by the way, to replace the Nagant revolver, this being the 9.4mm large frame version. Now, I sadly don't have the details of the tests involved in the trials, nor exactly why the little pocket pistol was chosen. I suspect the Belgians just didn't think the handgun needed to be all that powerful. It was an officer's weapon after all, and in a sense, they might have been right. The only real holdout for powerful handguns in Europe, that is, was the cavalry. And the Great War would soon teach us that that era was fading fairly fast. It's worth mentioning that as part of the trials, FN did submit a beefed up version of their pistol. Mind you, it was still chambered for the .32 caliber Browning cartridge, but now it had an 8th round. It was an inch longer and weighed 6 ounces more, about 170 grams for y'all who are bad with fractions. There was no need for the frame reinforcements because the frame was beefier overall. Records indicate that just 7 of those jumbo pocket pistols were made. Those seem to have been used for various trials and testing. Strangely, the Belgian government wasn't interested and opted for the pocket model, albeit with some minor changes. The result was adopted as the Pistolet Automatique Model 1900. Now, we can probably take a look at it. Alright, we have our improved military model, and of course, our 1899. Now, I know that bothers some of you, so let's just put these like this for a moment and do a quick rundown. The wood grips stand out, but we should probably ignore those for a moment because, well, I'll explain in a second. They would have been a sort of plastic before. But more importantly, and more obviously on all of these, there's going to be the enlargement of the reinforcing section of the frame. This comes all the way back to nearly the back of the trigger guard. This guy over here is pretty much halfway into the trigger guard and doesn't drop nearly as far down. That right there is a big bit of extra metal. It thankfully didn't add a whole lot of extra weight though. The safety is now marked fire and safe. Now originally these would have actually been polished by a round circle. So you'd had a dark blue gun, a round white circle with your sur and feu. This gun, however, has been refinished at some point. It probably has been re-arsenaled, as even the original government mark has almost been entirely lost and has been marked over by a later Liège proof. I'm not really sure what the story is there, other than that it probably went back into government service after the war. These grips are also an update. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, this safety itself is also changed slightly in that instead of having concentric circles, it is checkered very finely. Carefully aligning these pistols with the newer model here on the left, we can also see a couple of little improvements that came from government requests. The rear sight block was beefed up, and even on my example, you can see that the indicator for whether it was cocked or not, this little tab that we talked about a moment ago, is larger than on the 1899. And mine already seemed larger than most of the photos I saw, so this is a fairly big improvement. Now, on the serrations, you may have noticed, if you're very eagle-eyed, that there's fewer over here. They removed one step, but kept the same length in order to get a more rapid escalation to the outside, and therefore allow for a slightly better and more aggressive grip on this particular set of serrations, making it easier to cock the pistol. It's a minor detail and not necessarily easy to make out, but our shallow U-notch was replaced with a deeper V on the military model. Now, of course, you can't have a military pistol without a lanyard ring, so a staple was set in the frame and a corresponding groove cut into the grip in order to allow that ring, or allow the rope to go through. I shouldn't say cut, by the way, because again, originally this was a molded plastic grip. This was turned to wood later on. As a matter of fact, let's take a quick look at that. If we have both the old and new models together, you'll see the grip was enlarged overall. It takes up a lot more surface area, obviously fitted for the lanyard ring, and it was checkered entirely with no factory logo on the side. As a matter of fact, this grip, despite being made of wood, is a fairly good clone of the originals as they were introduced. Those were made out of vulcanite, which was specified not by FN but by the government. FN was actually using a different plasticized material. Neither one were great, and the vulcanite was frankly even worse. They tended to break very quickly, and production of that vulcanite was abandoned just a year later, and it was replaced with standard, well, not this, but standard commercial FN production of a full grip with a FN logo. But many of the grips obviously broke in service. More than half, probably most of them broke in service because of how poor quality they were. So very quickly, they started to be replaced with standard checkered wooden grips with like a brass ferrule as you're seeing here. If you ignore that these are made out of wood and just pretend they're made out of vulcanite though, it'll work just fine for what we're trying to understand about these differences, because it's more than just the material and the lack of a logo. You may see that this grip uses a sort of security slotted screw. We have tabs on either side, and it's true of both sides, by the way. It's not just that that screw is coming all the way through. See, center spud and then wingalings on either side. This, as specified by the Belgian government, is just a regular slotted screw so that you have easier access to the pistol. Also, on the inside, the retention system is different because neither of these, using a magazine going through the grip, are obviously going all the way through. These screws actually manipulate a set of tabs on the back side. I'll go ahead and get them out for you. With the grips removed off of both, I think the difference is fairly obvious. Well, the old model over here on the right used a circle with a little thingy on it. And then on the left, we have a crossbar. Both of them provide similar functions, and yet the crossbar is actually a little bit smarter. It's just not always as easy to use. On the circle, well, let's take a look at the inside of the gun. You can see it's actually supported in there on both sides. So you have to almost fully remove the screw in order to get the grip off. The reason for this tab is to strike up against that corner in there when you're tightening so that it stops and doesn't just free spin the entire time and never tighten up the grip. Now, it is possible to partially loosen and then sort of wiggle and get this guy out, but 9 times out of 10, you'd probably be best to just go ahead and loosen it all the way, let it drop, and get in there. On this particular example, though, the crossbar is a little bit more flexible in the sense that if we loosen the screw on the other side, you can just sort of reach up in the mag well with your screwdriver or anything else and just tip that over to the side and pop the grip off. It gives you a chance of disassembling the gun without having small pieces out where you're likely to lose them. You can then put it back on the gun and fish around in there until you get the crossbar in the right position and tighten down your screw. Now, since it's so difficult to get this pistol all the way apart, let's cheat a little bit and use Bruno's X-ray vision to see how it works.
Browning's pistol uses a detachable box magazine which will insert through the base of the grip. It's retained by this heel release latch, which is powered by the lower portion of this flat spring. Inserting the magazine depresses the lever until it snaps back into a notch at the rear of the magazine body. The cartridges are fed up from the magazine by this large coiled wire spring, which powers an L-shaped follower pressing on the lowest cartridge. Once loaded, the user grasps, retracts, and releases the slide. This presses the first round into the chamber. Just to be clear here, the breech block assembly is separate from the slide. However, both rigidly attached together by 2 screws, effectively making for one moving component. The breech block contains the firing pin. The barrel is fixed to the frame, and at rest is enshrouded by the slide. Over top of the barrel, set inside the slide, is the recoil spring, the base of which rests on an extension of the frame. The recoil spring is connected to the slide through 2 components. The first is the long recoil spring guide rod, which is pinned to hinge on the cocking lever. That lever, in turn, is pinned to the slide. This is an unlocked breech pistol, a blowback. So when we fire the pistol, the rearward pressure on the case is driven into the breech face, and the slide travels rearward until it strikes the frame. The recoil spring then drives the slide back forward, pulling along the next cartridge from the magazine. The cocking lever also makes contact with the firing pin, thanks to the teetering hinge point. There is constant pressure driving the pin forward. Pulling the trigger releases this tension. The firing pin is held back by the sear. This is powered by its own flat spring, keeping it constantly pressed upwards at the rear. Pulling the trigger tips the sear and frees the firing pin. The trigger is not connected directly to the sear. Instead, it uses this hinging transfer bar. The bar, and therefore the trigger, are powered by the upper portion of the same flat spring, which presses on the heel release. This keeps both forward pressure on the trigger and upwards pressure on the transfer bar's rear. It's also worth noting that the transfer bar is stirrup-shaped, wrapping around the magazine well. Pulling the trigger presses the transfer bar into the sear, tipping it to fire the pistol. If we freeze time for a moment, you'll notice that the transfer bar is not currently engaging the sear. That's because of the out-of-battery safety. If the rear of the transfer bar is lowered, it fits in a recess in the sear, no longer applying any tipping pressure. With the slide forward and battery, we can see that the transfer bar is again pressing upwards. It's able to do so because of a set of tabs at its rear top portion. They are able to meet with a set of notches in the underside of the slide. When we fire the pistol, the slide travels, and the transfer bar is driven out of the notches, falling low enough to disengage the sear, and therefore prevent firing pin follow. The safety is a simple lever that rotates an internal lug. This is biased into one of 2 positions by its own flat spring. Just flip it in order to lock the sear, such that it cannot be tipped. Flip it back to leave room to fire. And finally, the extractor is a simple spring hook attached to the breech block, and the ejector is an inset opposing hook in the frame. The extractor yanks the casing along with the slide, pulling it into the ejector, which flicks it from the ejection port on the right side. The pistol has no last round hold open, nor a slide release, so the process must be begun again from scratch. Now let's go shoot it.
Usually, when a government contract emerges for a new civilian firearm, production is changed over to that pattern. However, something interesting was happening over at Fabrique Nationale. The government's contract wasn't enough to displace the civilian demand in the market. That initial model, retroactively called the 1899, would only be produced into 1901, with apparently just under 11,000 total being produced. The initial government contract was for 10,000 Model 1900s, which would seem to represent 2.5 years of sales. That, however, only applies if commercial sales were evenly paced. Instead, demand for the pocket pistol was actually trending upwards exponentially. The market simply didn't understand it or hadn't even heard of it yet, but over time, this was quickly corrected. Instead of being unprepared for the sales growth, FN opted to start another production line exclusively for the government model. This left the original production line unaffected, and so the two models were leaving the factory at the same time. Now, Belgium did not have the largest military out there, and the hardy Nagant revolvers were hardly falling to pieces just yet, so sales were fairly light, 10,000 initial units largely for the government to sell to their own officers. Followed by, in 1901, an expansion to the gendarmerie and mounted artillery. In 1905, the FN 1900 was extended to the cavalry NCOs. By 1910, issue of the 1900 had all but displaced the Nagant revolver for the active duty forces. Even the Garde Civique followed by late 1912. Working from Vanderlinden's excellent book, which by the way covers all of FN's Browning pistols in exquisite detail, mind you, a must-have for collectors of any of these pistols, we find that the first 10,000 likely completed the Belgian needs until 1907. These were, by the way, given their own unique serial numbers, separate from civilian production, initially 1 to 10,000, though we'll see more later. You can spot a government pistol fairly easily, assuming that the markings are intact. The quickest tell would be a 2-letter inspector's code on the left side reinforcement, near the rear bottom corner. I will say, however, on my example today, it seems to have been largely buffed out during a refinish. So we're borrowing a later example here. Near the right rear of the rear sight, you can also spot an oval ring with the letters EGB, Éprouve Gouvernementale Belge. This is not a civilian proof. Not all pistols were unit marked, but some do turn up. Mine is marked with a W for the gendarmerie. You may find an H for a Lancer regiment, D for cavalry guides, or later on an A for artillery. The initial 10,000 unit order was completed in 1901, leaving FN with a spare line. Very minor changes were made to the military model of 1900, and the line was put back to work for civilian production. It was only at this point that the prior 1899 was halted and production was unified on what would later be known internally as the model of 1902. This variation by far is the most common in the collector's market today. The changes from the military are fairly minor. Now, you'll never guess, but I happen to have one of those guys here, so let's go ahead and take a quick look. While this little guy has a little bit of abuse on him, somebody stuck their initials on there, clearly the finish was ruined on this side. This example is actually perfect for our episode because in addition to being a 1902 model updated pattern, it's actually one that saw military service. So this guy is going to be perfect for filling in all the holes in this episode. But that aside, let's talk about what makes this functionally different from the precursor 1900. Now this grip is the last pattern with a plain FN logo replacing that sort of pistol and pistol thing we had going on. By the way, I just want to point out that is still a habit of this gun, even though it's not here. Just to show you what that might look like, I believe these are reproduction grips cast from an original. We have that pistol set in, and then they did a good enough job on these that I can flip it over and show you what we'll find underneath this grip as well. 2 locating holes that were actually used as part of the jigging process for producing these. These guys are not any sort of natural rubber vulcanite, any of that stuff. These guys are actually pressed horn, which is something that was inherited from the production of butt plates for the Auto 5 shotgun. This is a big, distinct advantage over the more brittle early pistols. You rarely see these damaged like you do the plastics. It's a bit difficult to make out, but the older model has a somewhat thicker and shorter lanyard loop. The newer model has a narrower and longer one, which by the way has developed a bend in it for exactly that reason that this one didn't. Go figure. The rear sight base, however, has been further bulked up. It's slightly taller and slightly longer again, so even beefier than before. And it's a bit difficult to make out, but the old V-notch is here, the new one is there. It's actually like just a shade deeper and a fair bit wider than the original. Well, the second. Now, serial numbers for these guys can be a little bit confusing because they restarted from 1 instead of continuing from the FN 1899s. Those guns, by the way, had prefixes and up to 4 digits. These just went for the whole shebang and bang and never prefixed. It's possible to find 2 of these guys with the same serial number because one of them may have been sold to the government before abandoning the government's serial run. That is to say, follow me if you will, you have the FN 1899 serial range, the government serial range, and then the commercial serial range for the new slightly variation of this, right? Then you have a number of these that are produced for government contract that are, again, slightly different in the ways we just saw. And those guns have a number that corresponds to the government contract, not to the internal commercial production, which at some point briefly overlapped. That should hopefully clear the confusion in that regard. Later on, as we're going to talk in this episode, these just start to use regular commercial serials, so there's no way the government had 700,000 of these, and yet this is a government-marked pistol. The timing on FN's expanded production ability was honestly perfect because in 1902, sales began to really climb. By August of 1904, some 100,000 Browning autos had been sold. This hit 500,000 in 1909, and just shy of 725,000 in 1914. This is already impressive without realizing that FN introduced 2 other pocket pistols over these years. The itty-bitty 1905 and the sleek 1910, which frankly displaced the old models in the marketplace. There would be no more major changes to the original Browning automatic, just the occasional minor difference in commercial markings as FN blew through stamps. The core reason for leaving the old 1900, or what we might call the 1902, in production after the 1910 was introduced, was because the Belgian government was still putting in limited orders, and there was some remaining demand despite the improved pistol, because people recognized this. Government orders after 1901 were filled with the Model 1902 variation and standard production grips. Those rose to a serial number somewhere around 130,000 in 1907. Then in 1908, the government-exclusive serial line was abandoned. We start to see government-marked pistols with serial numbers in the high 400,000s, and they climb from there. Overall, it's estimated that the Belgian government received roughly 20,000 FN 1900s, or the updated 1902, before the outbreak of the Great War. It remained the official sidearm of Belgium throughout the war, though FN was lost during the initial German invasion. Production of the 1900 was halted and not resumed after the war, though the government did request more. Part of this order was filled by scrounging available inventory and assembling what was on hand. The rest was filled with the Model 1910. Because of shortages during the war, Belgium had to purchase other pistols abroad. We've covered the biggest alternative in our Colt 1903 pocket pistol episode. Itself, another .32 caliber Browning. Now, while that cartridge isn't ideal for a battlefield, given its low power and penetration, Belgium wouldn't be the only one relying on the diminutive .32. The Spanish-made Star and Rubies were most of the French inventory, and later a good chunk of Italy's. Germany pressed all sorts of commercial .32s into service, many invented just to horn in on the Browning market. War use aside, the FN 1900 was popular worldwide for all the right and all the wrong reasons. Turn-of-the-century politics could be quite volatile, given that it was concealable, reliable, and inexpensive. The FN 1900 became the weapon of choice for various revolutionaries, assassins, and anarchists. It's worth mentioning, however, it was not used in the killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That was the Model 1910. The need for more security similarly boosted sales of the FN 1900 to police agencies. Various German states snapped them up, the Danish federal and local police, several states in Brazil, France, particularly the Parisian police force. Russia was a huge customer, and unsurprisingly, Finland snapped up many from the surplus thereof. Foreign military officers also sought out the Little Browning. Austria and France both had some in martial inventory during the war. Russian officers had purchased large quantities all the way up until the war, many being given as official gifts at officer school graduations. This guy should have petered out after production halted in 1914, but knockoffs abound. A variety of clones turn up throughout China during the warlord period. These can range from quite usable to vaguely similar in shape. Rewinding a little bit to the era of assassins, one such incident happened in Korea in 1909. Korean independence activist An Young-gwen used an FN 1900 to kill Ito Hirobumi, former Prime Minister of Japan. This made Young-gwen a hero to the Korean people, likely influencing a North Korean decision to produce the pistol domestically starting in 1964. Now, disregarding the model itself, Browning's pocket pistol revolutionized concealed carry of firearms. In the commercial market, it firmly established the utility of a magazine-fed automatic, flat in the pocket, and easy to use. This created a market that has lasted until today, which, by the way, is when we'll be asking Mae to fill us in on what it's like to shoot the FN 1900. Well, the actual 1900. Once more, we've made room for Mae.
Hi.
And we have lots of room for little guns.
We do.
We have, you know what, these are actually out of chronological order. Let me just fix that for you. Although we're from right to left.
Thank you. You know, I otherwise wouldn't have been able to tell. Not that much anyway. Aside from the grips. I know the grips are all different.
But we have 3 of Le Pistolet Browning. And sort of retroactively, as new models came out, these ended up being named. So you would have had the 1899, the original version. Then you have the sort of beefed up military version 1900, which was initially only sold to the military. Actually, it was only ever sold to the military. If you talk about a pure FN 1900, that is a military pistol. And then when they started up civilian production of the military model, they made slight changes again, also sold them to the military and civilians. And that's what the company kind of calls the model, 1900/02, although technically I think they started production in 1901.
Okay.
So a little confusing.
So 1899, 1900, and for the sake of not
1902.
confusing, 1900/02.
Right. Now,
Okay.
you have shot 2 of the guns on this table,
I have technically, yes.
in the sense that you've shot the pure 1900 now for this episode.
Yep.
But it had much later, not much later, but it had later updated wooden grips.
Correct.
And then you've shot an actual O2 commercial, but that was back in our original episode. We didn't shoot this
Goodness,
O2.
yeah, that was.
Yeah. So you've had experience with at least 2 or 3. We didn't choose to shoot the 1899 because it doesn't have a lot of difference between the others, and frankly, the front sight on this one's getting a little loose. These are hard to come by. I don't
Would be a
want
little
to dig through
annoying to have to try to find that out
Yeah,
there.
that went loose in the bush. I don't.
Yeah.
We'll keep this intact. So, with that in mind, starting with, I guess, let's just go straight for the 1900 since it's the focus of our episode.
Sure.
Let's get your impression of the ergonomics here, as if you're someone who is coming in around 1901, 1902,
Okay.
and maybe you've handled some military automatics like the, I guess at that time, the Borchardt Luger and the Colt 1902 military pistols would be like the most modern. And then otherwise you've handled revolvers.
Correct.
And for pocket carry especially, we're talking about like little 32 caliber bulldog style revolvers or something like that.
Sure.
And then you're handed this. What are your impressions?
Well, my first impression is actually just, this is incredibly small, and it's very, very, very narrow. More narrow than anything I've probably experienced at that time, actually.
In a firearm, yes. I don't know
Yes.
that there was ever a firearm this narrow before this gun.
I really wouldn't, that would actually concern me if for a brief moment being like, is it actually function properly? Can everything that normally fits and the scale sizes that we're talking about for other pieces actually just be squished like this?
Right.
It's fascinating.
From the introduction of magazine firearms, especially, like, so a cylinder is a kind of magazine or a loading box magazine. I don't think you're going to get this narrow.
No.
Maybe the Bergmans were pretty narrow, but then they had really small, weak cartridges, in many cases weaker than this.
Right.
And that still would have been a very exotic thing to see. This becomes readily available, mass-produced in the market. You can get it. This, from a consumer perspective, has to be really wild. Just the fact that it's as thick as like a penny novel, you know?
Yeah, and then it's not actually, I guess for how thin it is, I expect it to be a little bit lighter. There's actually a density here with this piece that I like because it makes it feel more stable of a piece to me. It kind of gives back that rigidity, that strength that I kind of need to make sure I feel safe with it.
Heavy implies quality. Okay.
So if it were incredibly light and this narrow, I'd think, what is it made out of?
Now, when we say heaviness, we're talking about a pound and some change.
Right.
That's not enough to weigh down your pocket terribly or like cant your jacket or anything like that.
Probably your shirt pocket, and I wouldn't recommend
Yeah,
you
we
try
got the
right
mic
now.
there.
But for a pants pocket, actually probably not that bad.
Yeah, and on a coat that's hanging off your shoulders, nothing.
So yeah, I like that.
Okay.
The grip itself, It's actually pretty comfortable, surprisingly. It is a little bit of a awkward angle that is not perfect.
Right.
But all my fingers fit on it, so that's pretty decent. All your fingers don't fit on it.
No. Well, actually, technically, I'm going to borrow this one for a second. All my fingers do fit on it in the sense that I can get all of them in there, and then the magazine toe is actually kind of cutting into my pinky a little uncomfortably.
Okay.
But I do have a good grip, and all fingers are on. It might be more comfortable for me to wrap my pinky, but honestly, either way, it would go fine. And, would I want a 1/4 inch more length? Sure, but clearly that would then get in the way of it being concealable.
Right. And it's not the perfect grip angle, but it's actually not too bad. It's
Right.
okay. Like, it's middle ground, I would say that.
There's actually a fair bit of variation in these grips.
Really? Between the 1899, 1900, and 1902?
No, between all of the Pistolet Brownings.
Oh.
Apparently, and this is coming from Vanderlinden's excellent book, there's not actually a constant shape for the back strap section area. Not that it's a separate piece, but just the idea of that back piece.
Okay.
And that's because the final grinding and contouring happened sort of after the fact or towards the end of things.
Okay.
And that part was done by hand. There's an initial jig, it got there's a forging.
It did the mass.
Yeah, there's a forging and then there's a rough cut jig or something of some sort. I don't know the exact details.
But then the final finished part was done by people.
But there's a sign that significantly, somewhere around like a 16th to an eighth of an inch was done by hand for the final fit.
Dang,
so you
I wish we could see which one was whose. Like, oh no, Jimmy did this one. Jimmy was real good with it.
Yeah, but it could have been
if you got Tom's.
It could have been same guy, different day. Or more importantly, it could be that there's just sort of a trend over years. But the point being is, if you grab a bunch of these FN 1900s and sort of line them up together and actually really like overlay the photos of them, you're going to get slight variations of grip. Not a lot, but they are going to be slightly different from each other.
Interesting. Well, that's kind of neat to know. Yeah. Otherwise, ergonomically, the actual slide, when I go to grip it, the tapering that they have right here on these little serrations is actually quite nice, and the serrations are spaced out really well. I don't think it needs to be any bigger than that because, frankly... Oh my goodness. Well, wait, what just happened? Oh, I have the safety on. Slide locks. I was like, I know that spring is light. What is happening here? No, but they don't need to be any bigger than what they are.
Look how easy the slide is.
Yeah, I'm struggling. Like, what is wrong with me? No. But it actually is quite a light slide. So, frankly, they're fine for what they are. And it's really easy to operate as the shooter. I love that.
Now, while we're talking about the serrations for a second, because we do kind of want to do some comparison here. We racked that like 3 times to yourself, just kind of... Okay. Now this one has different serrations. It has one more stair step.
I'm just going to kind of keep my eyes off it for a second.
Now, in theory, the fewer number of stair steps gave a more aggressive bite to the finger and made it easier to work.
This one feels more aggressive.
You know why, though? That one was a military pistol. This other one was a military pistol, so they both saw significant use.
Yeah, so they're worn down more.
These one's
actually
probably
feel sharp.
Because somebody just like racked it like 7 times, leaving it in their drawer.
Right. Now, these feel incredibly sharp by comparison. You should actually rub your finger along that.
No, these are they haven't been worn down.
No,
so it's an unfair comparison.
Yeah.
But ignoring the sharpness, if you can feel
the number of steps,
not the step, the angle.
Oh,
because what you've done is think about it, the peaks of each step.
Yeah.
Form a diagonal line.
True.
And then that line gets steeper if you have fewer steps.
Yeah.
So if you just feel for sort of how steep that is,
right?
And then
versus
feel, is it significant enough that you can tell is kind of...
I weirdly think so, because this kind of feels a little more...
Shallow?
Yeah, it just feels more like a slide versus... it doesn't... Yeah, there's not as much step down.
I'd love to feel a really sharp one, and we have long ago, but I don't think you could recall that.
Oh, God, no.
Because that was a commercial one that was fairly sharp, too. But regardless, even with the wear, easy to use.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Now back to the safety, which we discovered you know how to use.
Yeah, go figure. Good job, me. It's a little bit awkward in that the safety in and of itself is just, you have to reach back, break your grip in order to operate it. It's not perfect.
Is it
but
difficult?
It's okay. No, it's not difficult to operate. It actually the lever itself swings around pretty easily. Frankly, it's not difficult for me to operate. It's a little annoying that I have to reach back to grab them. However, not really uncommon for pistols of that time for that to be the case.
The one on this 1899 is very stiff, so I can't really make a comparison between having the round cuts.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's so stiff that I don't think you could really make a fair comparison to which one's grippier.
To be fair, this has not been operated very often for the safety.
Yeah. The one thing I have a problem with on these safeties is that, especially for my large hands, in order to get back and work the safety, I'm holding the gun with sort of like how do I explain this? I'm retaining the gun with the base of my middle finger all the way to the tip of my middle finger, and then some help from my ring and maybe pinky.
Yeah.
I'm not actually using any palm anymore. And
so you've lost stabilization.
I'm loosely giving some gravitational, like some anti-gravity support here. You know, like this, it's sort of swinging in the crook of my hand.
Sure.
But there's no real control there. And so when you have to break your grip that bad that you're just using your little finger pressure to hold onto the gun, it's not good in a quick motion because you might snap that right out of your hand trying to use your safety.
I can see that.
That's a big complaint on my part.
But ergonomically, I'd say we've got a lot of pluses with this guy so far. And in terms of, if I'm trying to think of more of a concealable piece,
Right.
definitely high up there.
It's hard to imagine actually making a .32 caliber pistol of this scale that uses not a slide with an attached breech block. We have seen examples. I did mention the Bergmans, so they're very compact guns, but not quite as compact and certainly not as successful as this.
Correct.
We did see, most amazingly, a locked breech .32 ACP of this size, the Frommer stock.
Oh, God, yeah.
Which is the most over-engineered thing I've ever seen in my life.
But absolutely gorgeous.
Yes, and that uses a breech block separate from this recoiling. Well, in this case, it's just a pseudo slide because it's not even attached to the barrel necessarily. But that is so unnecessary. Like I think we agreed on that episode. There was nothing about the Frommer stop that made it superior to this FN 1900.
God no.
But so much extra effort. So.
Oh, this is very refined.
Right.
I guess is my comeback to.
Yeah, it also came way later.
Yeah.
So, all right, we got through the slide, we got through the grips. Oh, you know what? You mentioned the grips on those.
Yeah.
You like the way that feels in your hand.
The military version? Yeah, actually, I will say that the whole piece itself feels narrow in and of itself, but I think the grips, I kind of like how wide they are.
The wood replacements are beefier than what we have here. I've never handled a pair of the Vulcanite military ones because they're so fragile. They're rare to find. I don't know how thick those were. I think they were thicker than regular production.
Yeah.
But go ahead and try that one, which you have shot before way long ago.
Yeah.
Which do you like better?
I think that these grips are just too narrow, like these older versions.
And then can you differentiate between the 1902 style grips and the earlier 1899s? Because those were...
these have an 1899 on the grip themselves.
It's something we noticed actually when we were sitting down to film this.
That's actually really cool.
Mae pointed out that the little FN Pistolet Browning that's in the grip depiction on the 1899 has the 1899 reinforcement, and I went, I wonder if they changed it. Now,
and they did.
These are these do not appear to be horn. These appear to be moldings taken from another one, but they should be cloned. And if that holds true, then this does have the big reinforcement.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, it actually has the safety on the wrong side because they mirrored it on this grip.
Oh, no.
Did I flip that over? Does it have the safety on the wrong side on that one?
Yeah, it does.
Oh, okay. So they kind of just mirrored the carving. You know, they gave them like one carving and they flipped it.
Yeah.
But it looks like they updated the mold for the new model.
Yeah.
Because people are going to be like,
the 1899
hold on a second.
the 1900.
Yeah.
That
I like that
shit
attention
is
to detail because there's some
ridiculous.
customer going, why is the reinforcing thing a different size?
You know, someone at the company pointed out, and they were just like, crap, we got to change it now, man.
I do. By the way, the gun depicts itself 3 times. Once on each either grip, and then once on that stamping there. And you're just going, jeez.
They really were trying to show you what you had.
I think this was Venture Brothers. It's like, why would you put a picture of a shrink ray on your shrink ray? And every time I just think of this, you know?
I could see that. But otherwise, you know, it's kind of interesting. I think these are even tinier.
No, they are. They don't.
Oh, yeah, they definitely are tinier.
But does it feel any different?
Oh, not really. They both kind of feel like plastic.
What? No, I meant to your palm as in
the palm, isn't it?
for grip?
Oh, yeah, no real difference there in terms of width, in terms of feel.
I feel like the added width isn't really enough to make your big old palm notice the difference in the frame.
No, but I definitely noticed the military. I will say that. Big step up for me.
All right, so let's get that military back in your hands.
Yeah, thank you.
And then, all right, so I guess we're down to sort of pointing the thing.
Yeah, and actually shooting.
How are those sights working for you?
We got a V-notch rear with a half-moon front.
Get them at full arm extension. Let's see.
Very narrow. The problem is that these are very fine sights. So when it comes to actual shooting, I mean, presumably I should be able to take my time with these shots.
Now, this was a U-notch. So do you like that better? That's the previous model.
No, because that's a really shallow U-notch.
Okay, so you like the military version
Yeah, I'll go
so
with
far?
the V-notch.
Now this is the later civilian/military O2.
Oh, I kind of like that. They've widened the V-notch. I think I like the O2 ones better because they've made it wider, which is much easier to see. Okay. So they're not quite as fine, which is nice.
Okay, good.
However, that being said, still, made a pretty good, decent target hit there. Mm-hmm. And then actually pulling the trigger on this one, it's a single stage trigger pull through, but it's heavy. The brake's kind of, it's middle row. It's okay. It's not perfect. Like, it's not super clean, but it's clean
I feel like
enough.
we've encountered worse 32s from later.
Yes,
We've
we
also
definitely
found
have.
better.
Yeah, we definitely have found better. So somewhere in the middle. It's okay.
Middle of the road. Didn't throw your shots at all, doesn't seem like.
Definitely did not. And then recoil from there is practically nothing.
Right.
It's pretty mild, which is fantastic. I was happy with it. And then my shots were steady, on point. I had a blast.
Yeah, I noticed on camera it's just like pow. It looks like Hollywood blanks, just nothing.
I mean, I try to allow some rock if there is going to be any, but for this one, there was barely any.
Well, you shoot pretty loose. We've been through this a few times. People get mad about Mae's lack of recoil control, and
I mean, I could just stiffen my arm and just grip hard. Like, I can get through. There'd be nothing. But then
I've literally been in a conversation with another noted gun tuber and said, well, no, we actually do intentionally shoot kind of loose to let the recoil transmit to the gun so you can kind of see it. And he literally goes, that's stupid. Like, he was offended. Because I understand what he's saying. He's saying you can just tell them about the recoil. But that's very subjective. It has a lot to do with the grip and things like that.
There's honestly being able to see it versus just talk about it.
And there is a world in which we arrange a swinging device that we bolt everything into and we remote trigger the gun with an equal weight mechanism, and then it swings and we take data. Like, I have considered how to do this. Mm-hmm. There's just no way, guys. I mean, we need to double our Patreon funds and hire a guy to do that exclusively. You know what I mean?
He's just our trigger guy.
I would, by the way. I've had ideas about how to do very scientific comparisons of these firearms. But unfortunately, that takes time that we don't have. We've got to make a show and get out there and to you guys.
Right, the documentary.
So we split the difference, and Mae just she gets a nice, easy, loose hold. Also, it lets us know there's going to be any malfunctions. A lot of you guys that are in the gunsmithing world know you shoot loose when you want to see if a gun's going to cycle for sure. Mm-hmm. So Mae will sit there and shoot kind of loose and just let the gun rock and then reset naturally so that we can see where the gun wants to recoil.
And then every once in a while we get to a piece where it does not like to be shot loose. So eventually I'll just have to dial it in and just basically slowly increase just my actual hold strength on it.
Yeah, and we're not talking about like floppy hand, but you've developed a sense of like, this is how I'm going to hold all these. And then that way, when we look at the footage, that rock that we're getting is something that you guys at home can perceive as a difference between the pieces.
Right.
The whole show for Primer has been set up for you, the viewer, to be able to compare what you're seeing on the screen because we try to be as consistent as we can within reason.
Yep. And so for you to see barely any recoil, there's barely any recoil.
Mae's not driving the pistol.
No, not by any means. It's funny.
Okay, so overall impression of sort of the family of Le Pistolet Browning.
Personally, I would have to go watch the episode all the way through to see the different changes that was made because they don't really feel all that different to me.
No, I'm asking you to assess them actually as just one thing.
Oh, just how I feel about them.
Yeah, just go off the one you shot. Like, we'll take the military 1900 as the example in this case because it's the one you shot recently. But what is your just gut reaction to this pistol?
That honestly, in that time period, that is a very positive thing to come out. I've got 7 rounds of 32, which is already 1 round extra over a revolver, which is fantastic. It's very narrow. It's very light. It's sleek. As a consumer, a civilian, or maybe in the military, so for that case, I can conceal it on me and hold it well. I could put several on me even if I wanted to.
Right. You have a brace.
Yeah, it's actually... It's pretty fantastic for what is available at that time.
How do you feel about taking it into warfare?
A little nervous. Because it is still just 32. Granted, I do have 7 rounds, but we know there will be betters later on.
I would take it over 32 caliber revolver.
Yes, I would too.
And I hate to say it, but there's been some big bore single action revolver, like a Smith & Wesson, like a good top break Russian Smith & Wesson that we like. That's our favorite, I think, of the single action revolvers.
It was pretty fantastic with that trigger spur especially added on there.
Yes.
Fantastic.
So that versus this.
Well, I would take this.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, why would I take a single action? I feel like there's no... I can't think of a semi-auto that I would take Or that I would take that over a semi-auto. I don't know one that I would take a single action over.
It feels a bit like you're
maybe the 19... No, wait, that's a revolver. Shoot.
No. So for single actions, in warfare, especially World War I, which is really what this one wanders into, you have that recock time and then the re-aim time, like re-delivering every time.
Right.
And if you're saying, look, you're going to engage 4 separate guys at 50 meters, blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine. All right. I'll take the single action maybe if it's just right. But chances are, the almost overwhelming statistical likelihood of what's going to happen to you is that you're going to be with a group of men. You're going to maybe even have a carbine that's available to you that's run out of ammo.
Fair.
Or there's been a breach or something, and you need to dispatch 1, maybe 2 guys in a hurry. And then after that, you've got problems anyway, you know? Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, any single action, no matter how good the cartridges or how good the grips are, unless you've trained and trained and trained on it and therefore don't have skills that you could have applied elsewhere to avoiding the situation through tactics, you know, you're going to have to work at killing some guys.
Right. Or at least stopping them.
Yeah. If something comes out of nowhere and goes, blah, blah, and I just have this little guy where I can get it to it in a holster and I just go and just dump that mag.
Yeah.
I'm very confident that I'm hitting. I'm fairly confident with 7 rounds I'm going to hit a vital spot.
Right.
I don't frankly know if it's going to put him down, which is a little scary.
Yeah, that's a little nerve-wracking.
But I'm still more confident of getting 5 out of 7 of those rounds into somebody than even 1 of 6 on a single action in a hurry.
Right.
And so I see where you're at, where it's like, hold on, I know I can deliver danger, and if I hit an artery or heart or something, I might be okay, but like...
There's a question that you are going to question whether or not it is going to stop him, though, because it's not a man-stopper cartridge.
No.
32.
It is an interesting problem.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would prefer a bore short Luger, and I'm sure you would.
Oh, yeah.
But, as it is for
that time period.
It's okay in war. Now, for personal defense in a city environment...
Fantastic.
Actually quite good.
Yeah.
You're not talking about someone that's out to specifically murder you in warfare at the cost of their life. You're talking about a robber...
Right.
You know, someone that's assaulting you.
And you have this in your breast pocket or something.
Right. It's literally the same thing that you're thinking of today for concealed carry for defensive use. You're thinking of people that are out to take something from you. And if you give them a little bit of lead, then even if it's not an immediate stopper, it's likely a fight ender at least.
Right. Or
and there's exceptions.
It can even just be just a talisman ward kind of thing.
Yeah. There's exceptions. But overall, better than nothing in your pocket.
Correct.
And certainly easy to... I mean, you could carry that...
Better than a knife.
A lady could carry that in her muff. You know, I mean, that's very small. So...
That is very muffable.
Anyway, today's episode was brought to you by the help of our special thanks friend, Brandon. Who I'm not allowed to talk about on our podcast anymore.
Yeah, he did restrict that.
And yet he's still my friend and loaned me one of these pistols here. So thank you, Brandon.
Thank you, Brandon. You are our special loaner of the episodes.
Yeah. And then we also have to give special thanks to Anthony.
Yes.
Who is our executive producer.
Anthony, thank you so much, man. The executive producership, that really has been very helpful, especially this year with us getting all of our indoor studio prep and stuff. So, man, we really do appreciate it.
Yep. For those of you who are not podcast listeners, which, by the way, is a patron perk, which is a $1 a month contribution. So I feel no guilt about paywalling that little thing. It's $1.
Yeah.
That's the tax on your coffee now.
People were yelling about that the other day.
Yeah, no. It says the old moniker used to be, it's as cheap as a cup of coffee. Now it's like, it's as cheap as the tax on your $6 cup of coffee. So, if you haven't been following any of that, we are working on sort of a studio overhaul, but we're going to be doing way more of the same thing. We're just going to be doing it better. We're not doing that thing where we've changed our minds and start working on a different project entirely.
No, we're just improving C&Rsenal.
Right. So there may be some vague changes in the schedule coming up. Don't be too surprised because we're going to bring you something a lot better.
There may be some changes around visually as
there's definitely going to be that.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway. All right. Thank you guys for joining us once again.
We appreciate everyone.
Bye. And I was just like, I don't know what I drove into, but I am the bringer of death now. I don't know what I'm killing.
Well, you and everybody else that was there too.
Yeah, I know, but my guilt is not diffused by how many people are involved in the atrocity. Okay,
Oh, okay.
I still feel sad.
Yeah. That's fair.
I still feel very sad. Right when we started talking about doing a live stream, and we were like, hey, everybody send crayon drawings. We got this idea, right?
Yeah.
And then I think 2 weeks later, or whatever
YouTube
it was,
came down.
YouTube is like, you can't touch a gun in a live stream. And
period.
We went, mother, because that was like the whole premise was to sit there and like pull stuff apart and talk about it. And
you're going to talk about while cleaning them and like doing full disassemblies on stuff that we had to do anyway.
Right. So now you're not allowed to touch it. And so that blew us completely out of the water. And so it's not that we gave up on the crayon drawing / live stream idea. It's that
I have them all saved aside.
Yeah, we still have them, and we're really disappointed that happened. But also, gosh darn it, not the same. I don't know how to explain it. It's like you get the compliments, but they're kind of reserved compliments.
Right.
Whereas with the scooter, it's just gushing.
Instant electricity.
Just gushing. Like what?
You're crushing on someone, instant crush, you know? It's that like, same electric.
There's layers like an onion, because I'm just like, it'll do 75, and they go, what? It doesn't have a clutch. What? You know?
It's got neon lights. What?
Right. But with Suzuki, it's like, oh, it's the 1980, it's 1100, and they're just like, yeah, it's really cool. That looks nice. It's in really good condition. Yeah. They're not like it's a YouTube face the whole time with the helix. Oh, God. That whole piece slides out. Now this to me is again a delicate feature on this gun because, and I have seen these damaged in person before, these two little tabs right here, they worry me, especially taking damage from the front. That probably to me is the most vulnerable point in this whole system. Outside of that though, let's get over